Have you ever, like, seen one of those quotes or memes online and it just kind of hits you, you know? It just seems so right.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like those inspirational quote cards people share.
Yeah, exactly. Like, one I saw recently was education isn't teacher or student centered. It's relationship centered. Learning happens through connection, trust, and collaboration. And you read it and you're like, well, duh, of course.
Right. Seems like common sense. Good relationships, that's the key to learning.
Exactly. But, I started thinking about it more and I was like, but what does that actually mean? What does that look like in practice? And that's where things get kind of interesting, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it sounds good on the surface,
Hmm.
but when you actually start digging deeper,
Right. And that's actually what got us looking into this article by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks called When Relationship Centered Isn't Enough on Slogans, Silence, and the Work That Still Needs Doing.
such a good title.
I know, right? And it really unpacks that whole meme, that saying, especially for people whose experiences in school, well, maybe haven't always felt so connected or collaborative.
Yeah, exactly. And for this deep dive, that's kind of what we wanted to explore with you, like what does genuine connection and learning really require? Is it more than just like warm, fuzzy feelings and nice words?
Right, because it can't just be a slogan, can
Exactly. We wanted to look beyond those feel-good phrases and dig into some of those deeper issues, maybe even like systemic stuff that can get hidden when we oversimplify things. Like who gets left out when we make everything sound so easy and straightforward.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to consider like where this quote even came from. It's attributed to Dr. Brad Johnson. Harricks mentions that he's a former military officer who now does educational consulting and motivational speaking.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And he's known for this really positive, like agreeable social media content, the kind that school administrators and HR departments seem to love.
I can see why. Safe, non-controversial.
Yeah, and it kind of gives off this air of emotional intelligence, but doesn't always push for any critical thinking, you
Yeah.
know?
Right, you just nod along.
Exactly. And then you have Harks's perspective, which is so fascinating to contrast because they've actually lived and worked within those educational systems and they identify as autistic, which brings a really unique lens to this whole idea of relationship centered education.
Absolutely. It's not just theory for them. It's like their reality.
Right. And Horrocks is really clear in the article that this isn't just about one meme going viral. It's pointing to this bigger pattern we see, like how the education system can use this language of warmth and care while kind of masking some pretty serious problems underneath.
Yeah, and overlooking those fundamental structural reasons why some people, well, they just aren't thriving.
Okay, so let's get into this relationship centered thing as a slogan. Like, what's Horrocks' main argument against it?
Well, they're not saying connection, trust, collaboration, those things aren't important. Of course they are. But their point is that framing education solely as relationship-centered can actually erase this really crucial thing, structural violence.
Structural violence. What do you mean by that?
It's like, saying a car that keeps breaking down just needs a new coat of paint. It completely ignores the engine, the transmission, all those deeper mechanical issues.
Oh, I get it. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
Exactly. So, in education, if things aren't working, instead of looking at the system itself, we can get caught up in focusing on the individuals.
Right, like the teachers or the students.
Exactly. Like, oh, if a student isn't doing well, maybe the teacher didn't connect well enough,
Right.
or, oh, maybe that student just isn't open to relationships.
So the blame gets put on those individual interactions without questioning the system itself.
Right. Like, is the system actually set up in a way that supports those relationships in a fair way for everyone? And Hoerricks brings a really crucial perspective here when they talk about how this affects autistic people, especially those with hyperempathy and alexithymia.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Can you explain that a bit more? Like, why is this framing especially problematic for autistic individuals?
Okay, so, you know, autistic folks might experience and understand relationships differently. People with hyperempathy, they're super tuned in to the emotional vibes in a room, sometimes feeling those emotions really intensely. But then there's alexithymia, which makes it hard to identify and explain your own feelings. So in a system that's all about relationship, it can be really tough for autistic people. Because if they're struggling, it can get seen as them not putting in the effort to connect,
Right.
when actually it might be a mismatch between their needs and that learning environment. So relationship can almost become a way to blame them, both by others and even themselves.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. So it's not as simple as connect and everything's great. For some people, it becomes another way they feel like they're not measuring up.
Exactly.
Now, Horrocks talks about a different kind of pattern they've noticed, a 5-step process. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so instead of this straight line from connection to learning, they've seen this five-step pattern in their own life and work that feels way more real. First, there's recognizing harm. And this often isn't like an intellectual thing right away. It's more like a gut feeling, Something feels off.
Like a physical sensation almost.
Yeah, like something's wrong, but they can't always pinpoint it at first.
Interesting. So that's step one. What's next?
Step two is wondering if it's just them. That self-doubt that creeps in. Like, am
Yeah.
I overreacting? Am I the problem here? Especially if you've been told in the past that you're too sensitive or that your experiences aren't valid. It's internalized gaslighting, basically.
Oof,
Yeah,
feel that. That feeling of isolation can be so tough.
it is. But then step three is where things start to shift. That's when they start researching others' experiences. They look for those shared stories, online communities, articles, talking to people who get it. And that's when they realize, oh, wait, I'm not alone in this.
It's so validating, right, to find other people who've gone through something similar.
Totally. And that leads to step four, discovering those systemic patterns. It's moving beyond individual experiences and seeing those larger structural issues, like connecting the dots and realizing, wait, this isn't just a me thing. This is happening to a lot of people because of how this system is designed.
So it's not a personal failing, it's actually a pattern.
Right. And then the final step, 5, is writing towards both understanding and creating alternatives. So it's not just complaining, it's actually doing something about it.
Taking action.
Yes, it's making sense of things through writing, providing resources for others, and building those new solutions.
I love that. So it's this messy, real process, right? Not some simple relationship equals success equation.
Exactly. And Hoerricks brings up this other really cool idea, the UX of exclusion.
UX.
Yeah, like user experience, the kind you think about with websites and apps.
Okay, got it.
So they're saying if the design of the learning environment, like the interface, is bad, if it's exclusionary, then real connection and learning become almost impossible. Doesn't matter how much people want to engage.
That's a great analogy. And they actually share some personal experiences about this, right?
Yeah, they talk about trying to go back to school around 2003. They needed a degree to move up in their career, but the local community college was just awful for them. Like overwhelming, chaotic, cold. They called the UX atrocious.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they ended up withdrawing multiple times, feeling like they just couldn't handle higher education.
That must have been so discouraging.
Totally. But then they had this totally different experience in a cohort-style BA program. And it wasn't about like a special bond with a teacher or anything. It was held in a conference room at sheriff's headquarters, of all places.
Really?
Yeah. And what was key was that it was predictable, familiar. Like they knew that space, it was easy to navigate, no sensory overload, no confusing bureaucracy. That design, that interface, actually helped them succeed.
So it wasn't forcing relationships, it was creating a space where connection could happen naturally because those barriers were gone.
Exactly. And that experience was huge for Hoerricks' doctoral research. They realized that so often, when learning doesn't work, we blame individuals instead of looking at the design of the environment itself.
Right, like we assume it's a student or teacher problem.
Yeah. And their research became all about how to design learning spaces that are intentionally inclusive for all kinds of learners, not by forcing connections, but by thinking carefully about how those spaces are set up.
Fascinating. And they also talk about credentialism and how it impacts neurodivergent people, especially in their work with forensic science.
Oh, yeah, this was so interesting. They noticed a lot of the really skilled forensic analysts, especially in those digital and multimedia fields, were neurodivergent. Yeah, they were amazing at seeing those complex systems, finding patterns that others missed.
So their neurodiversity was actually a strength in that field.
Absolutely. But then things started to shift. There was this push to raise the educational bar, requiring bachelor's degrees, master's, even PhDs for those same jobs.
Oh, so experience wasn't enough anymore.
Right. And this created so much anxiety for those experienced neurodivergent analysts. Many of them had struggled in traditional academic settings, and now they were worried that their practical skills wouldn't be valued anymore.
That makes sense, like their expertise was being devalued.
Yeah, and Hoerricks felt that pressure too. They actually decided to pursue multiple degrees, not for status or anything, but almost as a way to protect themselves.
Like if those qualifications were the new gatekeepers, they needed them to stay in the field.
Exactly. They saw it as this closing door, and they weren't going to let it lock them out.
I get it. And they also talk about how this focus on credentials can actually hurt those fields.
Yeah, because it prioritizes conformity, like fitting into that traditional academic mold over those unique talents and perspectives that neurodivergent people bring.
It's almost like weeding out brilliance because it doesn't look how we expect it to.
Exactly.
And then Hoerricks gets into the whole California teacher induction process. How does that tie back to this relationship-centered idea?
Well, they describe induction as this long, high-stakes review for new teachers disguised as a mentorship program. And it's sneaky because it reinforces that idea that if students are struggling, it's the teacher's fault, like they didn't build strong enough relationships.
So again, the focus is on that individual connection instead of looking at the curriculum, the school environment, all that.
Exactly. And Hoerricks points out that induction is super focused on consuming information, going to workshops, following these preset frameworks.
It doesn't sound very creative.
Right. It doesn't really value teachers as thinkers.
Yeah.
Like they're not supposed to come up with their own ideas, just follow the program.
It sounds more like compliance than genuine support.
Yeah, and they argue that this system isn't really about relationships in a meaningful way. It's about compliance. It uses the language of care and development, but ultimately it wants teachers to conform, not to be original.
And that leads to another important point Hoerricks makes about the unseen labor that neurodivergent teachers often have to do.
Yes. So for autistic teachers, especially those with hyperempathy and alexithymia, this constant pressure to build relationships in this performative way, it takes a huge toll.
I can imagine.
They're always feeling so much, but it's hard for them to name those feelings, to express them in the way the system expects.
It's like this internal conflict, isn't it?
Right. And in those school environments where they're expected to be constantly smiling, checking in, showing enthusiasm in this very specific way, it's exhausting. And the system doesn't even recognize that effort, that cognitive load. It just sees whether they're performing correctly or not.
So it becomes more about masking and fitting in than actually connecting with students authentically.
Yeah, and Hoerricks talks about their own struggles with these forced social interactions, those scripted ways of relating, their natural way of building relationships, which takes time and shared interests and trust. It doesn't fit that mold.
And they talk about this autism tax, too.
Right, that's that extra energy and effort that autistic people have to spend just to function in a system that wasn't designed for them. The constant self-monitoring, trying to read those social cues, trying to appear emotionally fluent when it doesn't come naturally.
It's that energy drain that most people don't even see.
And it can be misinterpreted, Like when a neurodivergent teacher seems withdrawn or flat, it might not be disinterest. It might be that they're overwhelmed, they've been overloaded for too long.
It's like a protection mechanism.
Exactly. But the system misreads it as a lack of connection.
So much to think about. And despite all these challenges, Hoerricks' work isn't just about pointing out problems, it's about solutions, right?
Absolutely. They're all about creating alternatives. And they have this great concept of refusal. Yeah, like refusing to accept those harmful systems. And for Hoerricks, refusal is a way to create, like when they see a gap, something missing for diverse learners, they build it.
They take action. I love that. And they have some amazing examples of this.
Right, like their work, No Place for Autism. It addresses that lack of understanding about neurodiversity in teacher training. Then there's holistic language instruction for those Gestalt language processors who get ignored in traditional language education.
It sounds like they're filling in those missing pieces.
Exactly. And they're doing it in their own teaching practice, too. They have decolonizing language education and the story of math, which is a whole curriculum designed to be inclusive for students who are often left behind. These aren't just side projects. They're woven into everything they do.
That's so powerful. They're leading by example.
And it's important to note, these projects weren't assigned to them. They came from their own experiences, their commitment to making things better. It's like this form of leadership that often goes unnoticed.
So when we look back at that meme we started with, it really highlights how, for a lot of people, especially those who've been marginalized, it just doesn't ring true.
Right, like if you've constantly faced exclusion, that simple idea of relationship-centered education, it can actually feel dismissive. Like your struggles are just about you not connecting, not the system's fault.
It puts the blame on the individual again.
Exactly. So it's not that relationships aren't important, but that genuine connection and learning can't be forced, especially in systems that are designed to exclude certain people.
It can't be measured by these simple metrics.
Right. True relationships, the kind that support learning, they need more than just good intentions. They need care, consistency, co-creation, safety, time, trust, shared power. Those things are so hard to build in systems that value standardization and performance over actual growth.
Yeah, it's about creating the conditions for real connection to happen, which isn't easy. And Hoerricks ends the article with this really hopeful message.
Yes, they say that when the systems fail us, we create our own alternatives. We find new paths. We build communities in those
We
margins.
make our own spaces.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that's so powerful,
Yeah.
that refusal to accept exclusion. It's about creating something better, something more human.
It really leaves you with a lot to think about. Like, what about the learning environments you've been in? Were they truly relationship-centered in that deep way Horrocks talks about? Or were they asking you to adapt to a system that wasn't built for you?
That's the question.
And what about now? What can you do, even in a small way, to build something new, to refuse what's harmful, to make those connections more authentic and inclusive? I think that's something worth exploring.